go. Hello. Welcome. My name is Chris LaRoche. I am a member of, we're in DSL and part of the Disability and Access Services, and we're the Accessibility and Usability group. I'll be presenting today, and my colleague Catherine Wall is here as well, and she'll be handling many of the questions we have through the chat, which I will ask people during the presentation. If you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat, and Catherine will then ask me during one of my pauses, and then also we'll have an open discussion or questions at the end of the presentation, which take about 30 to 40 minutes. Just want to introduce ourselves. We are part of the accessibility and usability team, and we are essentially internal consultants on accessibility, usability, and user experience. So if anyone in the Institute has any questions about their projects, whether they're websites, internal software, third-party software they're using, you can contact us at usability@mit.edu or accessibility@mit.edu, and we can talk to you and assist with any problems, concerns, questions, or even if you want presentations for your department. So feel free to be in touch with us. So I'm going to share my screen now. Hold on just a second. Okay. So Catherine, I just wanted to make sure the screen, you can see the screen.
Works.
The
Yep,
screen is viewable
great.
for all. Excellent. Okay. And again, if people have questions during the presentation, please just put it in the chat box and Catherine will ask me them. And at the end, we will have an open-ended discussion. So first and foremost, just kind of going to go over what is user experience. That's the main thing I want to talk about. And then just talk about the methods, the context of user experience, the idea of design, where the future is, and then I will have a bibliography that you can feel free to look at after for some of the main websites that exist about user experience, just trying to help fill in some of the other questions you might have. So what is user experience? One of the things that I've found very interesting as I've been in this field for a couple decades is the terminology. I call it the alphabet soup of user experience. So the terminology you'll hear is kind of ubiquitous. You'd hear the term usability, user experience is more common these days. You also could have heard the term human factors. You can heard design, research, product design, information architecture. And the reality is that there is a common set of various methods and various best practices that we use in our field. However, each industry, as this field has matured, each industry has had their own terms, and hence that's why we have the alphabet soup of user experience. So one of the things, so part of the problem with user experience, both its strength and greatest weakness, is that it's incredibly interdisciplinary. This is an older image that just shows where all of the fields of user experience kind of come from, and there's a real kind of mixture. I mean, we really did start way back when, which I'll talk a little bit more about, from the field of cognitive psychology. And that's where a lot of the basis of just how people think and act and the brain processes things. But over the last 30 years, and particularly in the last decade, there's been a lot of different fields that really come into our field and that kind of can be considered user experience. I mean, ergonomics is one of the other original ones. Also, there's the idea of computer science has really been critical to our field, and also the various graphic design, visual design, software design really is also part of it. And also the idea of library science has actually been one of the core foundations of a lot of user experience, particularly regarding information architecture. So all these fields, and there's even more that are happening, but our field really is very interdisciplinary, which actually makes it very exciting and also helps give it a tremendous amount of different perspectives. So when people ask me, like, what is user experience and where does it come from? And I kind of go back and say it's been generations, centuries, maybe even millennia. The idea is to kind of find a task to complete in the most stress-free and easiest way for somebody. So I use this idea of way back when you had to move things, people would want to use a wheel or a tire or something to kind of move things easier. And this rock is but one example. And really what we're doing is just manifestations of that, is trying to get something that's more efficient, that works to what the user's goals and behaviors are, whatever that is. We think about it as technology, but it really doesn't come necessarily from that. So as just explained, user experience and usability are concepts that really have existed for a long, long time. Over the last few decades, I'd say over the last 5 or 6 decades particularly, UX has become much more standardized and has expanded greatly. The modern era of usability, user experience, and human factors, which is a more academic term for it, really started during World War II, because with the rapid proliferation of technology, there was a lot of academic research in psychology on instrumentation, how people reacted to things. And during World War II, particularly with the use of controls and instrumentation, was really one of the foundations of what we'd call human factors, which was much more in the academic realm, but it was used to make it so people could actually look at a tremendous amount of information and process it and group it in certain ways so that they wouldn't actually become overwhelmed, because that was happening tremendously. And there was, during the entire war, there was many times during people were not able to use the right levers in airplanes particularly. After the war, I'd say from the early 60s through the 80s, within the software and computer hardware industry, the idea and concept of usability, of making something that's a little bit more usable, from the punch cards all the way to the command line system to having some type of interface, really started to evolve. The field existed then, but it really exploded in the early to mid to late 90s with the advent of the web, because everything was so much more graphical and there was user interfaces that were much more important. It needed to be kind of standardized in a way. And that's really what the world that we've been living in, most of us that work in UX, really come from. I'd say within the last 15 years, the advent of consumer devices and really making sure that consumer devices are easy to use. I mean, the most obvious example of this is the Apple products that weren't technologically sophisticated as others, but they were very usable, they were aesthetically pleasing, and they completed the task. I'd say of late, the last decade or so, there's been a real focus on medical devices, and particularly even before COVID, we're seeing how just the importance of not only medical devices, but also using websites that people can use has been kind of a real issue. So human factors does come from the field of psychology and focuses on understanding the basic biological human traits and mapping to users' needs. And what this means is actually understanding how our brain works and how much information we can process at a certain time and what we can't process, and how colors and other things affect how humans judge and can process things. As I said, really the advent of the software, the hardware, and then the web industry really has kind of made our field grow exponentially. The other thing, it also has, I'd say, particularly the last 10, 15 years, it's not just talking about the user interface, it's more about the end-to-end experience. And that's really become much more important and made for very many more needs for what we do, but also expectations as well. An outgrowth of human factors and early usability work centered on something called user-centered design, which was developed and devised in the mid-1980s. Overall, user-centered design is a framework and method to create products that correctly match a user's need, expectations, behaviors, and goals. Um, Products that do use UCD principles are going to be more successful because they incorporate the user from the initial planning stages. One of the real cruxes of this is know thy user, know thy user, know thy user. And that's really important. And companies and organizations that do that and focus on knowing thy user do produce more successful products, websites, services. This phrase here from the gentleman who termed the coin information architecture is really the crux of everything around user experience. And it's something that I have actually struggled with in all my years, to be really cognizant of this. The key to making things understandable is to understand what it's like to not understand. And one of the things as humans, once we learn something, we assume that is common knowledge. It's just how humans act and interact. So it's very difficult sometimes to step back and try to explain something or understand how it works if you understand how it works, but not really understanding and relating to how a user who might not understand that really will interact with this. So that's part of the crux of user-centered design, is really to understand what it's like to not understand. Here are some of the main principles of user-centered design. It is really an ease of learning and relearning, the learnability aspect, the ease of use, the efficiency, how can you complete a task very quickly. And Amazon and Walmart online, for example, are ones that have done this very, very well the last few years. Consistency within and between products. If you're using a suite of products, you want to make sure that they're actually consistent. I mean, Adobe has done a really good job of that the last 20 years. First impressions, error prevention and recovery, so you don't accidentally delete something and then lose hours worth of work. Memorability, satisfaction or likability, flexibility and discoverability, and improved collaboration for groups of users. And this is particularly important as we're using many more online tools in a group environment. What user-centered design is not, and this is almost as important as what it is. So users are not designers and designers are not users. And that might seem really obvious, but it's very important that people who are designing products, they have an expertise in design. They don't have an expertise in the product per se. So you really need to involve users. And user-centered design is more than common sense. What we have here is, and I don't know if some of you might have seen this example before, but this is a car called the Homer. This was from season 2 of The Simpsons way, way long ago. And Homer had a long lost brother who owned a very successful car company. So his brother said, oh, Homer is an average Joe, so he can go and he can design a car for me, and then I can sell that to millions of people. So what he did is he asked Homer what he wanted. And so Homer decided he wanted lots of coffee cups around the car. He wanted lots of loud horns, and he wanted a separation between him and the kids, so the kids could be in the back and he didn't have to listen to them. The long and the short of it is his brother made this car and it was an absolute miserable failure. Nobody bought it, and his brother went bankrupt after being a very successful automobile person. The lesson from this is that users are not designers and designers are not users. So you have to talk to users, but you have to talk to a wide variety of users. One of the big sins of UX is when you design for one or design for one person. You have to understand who your users are and the groupings that they're in. The irony of this is 20 odd years later, or 25 odd years later, many of the things that were kind of thought of as a joke in Homer's car have become true. Like, can you think of a car built in America today that doesn't have at least 1 or 2 coffee cup holders, which was non-existent in the early 1990s? And also the separation. Many cars today you'll see will have video screens or a little bit of a separation between the front and the back, particularly in SUVs, so the kids can kind of watch TV, or people can watch TV or videos in the back while the driver isn't interrupted. So some of this does come to fruition, but it is very important to realize not to just build to one user. So for the sake of clarity, user experience is an open-ended term, and as I talked about the alphabet soup, it really has kind of expanded over the years. But I say, just for the sake of how we discuss it, and particularly this discussion, I really kind of put it into 3 buckets, which is research, design, and evaluation. Let's talk a little bit more about that. Research is really understanding users' needs and goals and behavior, and really talking to users throughout an entire process. Design is creating and designing the interface or the experience the user needs or desires. And this isn't only interfaces anymore. It can be a process, for example, like in a cafeteria line. If somebody, how do they want to go about it? Like if you go to most cafeterias, if we ever go back to them, they always put dessert first. That's because that's the most enticing thing and it's the highest margin. But then you'll go through that. But thinking how you can do that in an efficient way, and even now, particularly in a socially distant aspect, that's going to be something we're going to be living with for a long time. Evaluation is once the interface or product is in some kind of working state, you can test and evaluate the user, the interface or the product with the users to see if the product, the way it has been researched and designed and looks, actually matches the user's mental model or what they expect of their needs. Within our field, methods are really one of the cornerstone of everything that we do. When the profession first emerged in the software and hardware industry in the late 70s, 80s, the main method was known as usability testing. And most of you might be familiar with that because that's kind of the standard of our field. Usability testing really was a mix of both scientific and kind of artistic ways of understanding the user's perspective on a product. And it made our profession very visible and viable. With that, the methods that we're going to talk about really evolve from usability testing. So our field is not really just usability testing anymore, which is where it started. So when I was talking about research, design, and evaluation, these are the primary methods that we would use today. In research, we do user interviews to talk to users about their understanding of a product or a workflow. We do something called card sorting and reverse card sorting, which is taking navigational and labeling terms and just see how people organize them to see if the way that they organize them matches the way a website is or was or will be. Surveys ubiquitous. I think everybody probably has done a survey. The important thing that we really work on is making sure that we write up surveys so that they're not leading or biased or have terms that are leading in any way. User observations, which comes from the ethnography field. Sometimes, especially in pre-COVID, we would follow people around the office just to see how they went about a day, to see how they interact with certain services or products. Storyboarding is a way when you're going through and telling stories about what people will do in relation to a product, service or workflow. Journey mapping is also a way to kind of put everything down in an end-to-end experience, how people would actually go about doing things and what they have to go through, a number of processes or different websites or things they have to go through. Prototyping is kind of ubiquitous, and I'm sure most people have heard about it. There's all kinds of prototyping, and that really is the beginning of design. This can be from sketching to paper prototyping, to slightly interactive prototyping, to things that are almost working or fully working. Quite often we can do that even when things are actually already released. And within usability testing, that's really morphed the last few years. There used to be the traditional moderated where we'd sit in a lab with a usability person such as myself, and we would be a moderator and somebody would go through a set of predefined tasks. That still exists, though it's mostly been done online even before COVID. There's also something called unmoderated, which we use and just put a set of tasks up, send people the link and have them do the test without a moderator. And then there is remote and in lab. Remote has become more and more popular in the field of late because you can usually reach people and more people versus in lab where you would have to have somebody come to a physical location. We also do something called an expert review and evaluation, which is we are experts in user experience. So we will look at designs before they start development just to see if it adheres to basic standards, such as making sure there's no more than one search box per field, making sure the type and the text and the font is of adequate size, making sure there's adequate color contrast, a variety of things like that. So we can set up a best practice before they start development. A heuristic review is something that's an older standard in our field, where there's a set of usually 10 standard things that people will review against to make sure that that the website or the proposed website actually does adhere to these consistency and standards. And again, surveys are also used for evaluation. Surveys are a ubiquitous tool. I would really say if people want more information on all this, we're happy to talk, but also the usability.gov website is an excellent resource from the United States government. And it lists not only methods, but also a tremendous amount of templates and also design things too. One of the things about UX is the idea of context. Part of the overall issue with understanding usability and user experience is the impact of context on the use of product or service. And this is really, really critical. It also makes standardizing the idea of UX very difficult because everything can really vary with a particular product or a group of users. There are several different terminologies from the ISO, but this is the one that we often refer to and tell people to really understand about the context of user experience. And it's a little bit older, so it uses the term usability, and usability and user experience are quite interchangeable at this point. Usability refers to the extent to which a product can be used by a specified users to achieve specified goals with effectiveness, efficiency, and satisfaction in a specified context of use. Now, that's really clear, despite the time of using specified 3 times. It really nails the idea of you actually have to focus on a specific context of use to understand if something is or is not usable. Along those lines, the term "it depends" is frequently used when asked if a product is usable or good user experience. Again, all experiences are contextual. So one product that might be usable for one person and not usable for another. An example of that is there might be a product that technically is not that usable, but if someone has been using it daily for a year, they know how to get through it quite efficiently versus somebody who is new to the product. It might take them a tremendous amount of time to understand it. Um, the idea that's a little bit old now, but it was very interesting when Office, I don't know if folks remember, Microsoft Office came out for 2007, and it was all using it had gone away from the traditional file structure, and it kind of started to use the ribbons. So theoretically, that was much easier for somebody to learn from new. But the problem was most people were very used to using the Office file structure of the file system of like edit, view, things like that. So it took people who were used to it a lot longer to understand the ribbon system, but people who were new to the ribbon were actually able to understand and use a lot of the aspects of the Office products much quicker. One of the things is user research really helps determine aspects of context to help understand which way it would work best for the group of users you're actually focusing your product or service on. Oops, sorry, I think we have. So one of the things I want to talk about now is design. Design wasn't part of the idea of usability initially, but it's become a huge part of the user experience realm in the last decade. It really, there used to be kind of a lot of tension between designers and user experience people. But over the last decade, design has really nicely fit into the idea of user experience. And hence, we kind of can have the end-to-end process, as I described it, research, design, and then evaluation. And right now, design is rightly seen as a critical component within the overall UX. And along that way, it's also made the idea and just the power and the influence of user experience much larger. Um, the important thing within this is the idea of having all these three groupings really has made it so that we can be involved in the entire end-to-end product life cycle of a product, or service, or a website. Um, and I would say since around 2008, 9, it's really when design has really started to make inroads, and it's really, really kind of gained speed the last 5 or 6 years. So it has actually really helped because I'd say 15 to 20 years ago, we couldn't really expect more than doing some usability testing at the best. The idea of research and design was just something that really wasn't in our realm, or we would never be given time to do. I also wanted to say there's another website, the US Web Design Systems, which is again another US government site. It gives a lot of information about design best practices. And this itself too is a really good way to just, if you have ideas or you have questions about what would be best for a particular widget or what would be for an interaction with a design type, this is really, really helpful. So just really kind of want to think what about the future of UX and where we are now and where we're going to be going? The interesting thing is that the future of UX is very bright. The UX is now really an important concept in many products, and it's much more than needing to have a good user interface. It needs to be a whole overall kind of helpful, useful product that you can expect an end-to-end usage of. One of the things that's really kind of evolved the last few years is the importance of UX has also led to the emergence of something called UX strategy, particularly in larger organizations. They just want to have an overall comprehensive strategy about their user experience, whether that means having consistency among different products you have, or having an understanding of how one product isn't going to be alone, and you have to think about it from a very higher level. Again, part of this is from design has become further integrated and ingrained within user experience. So that's allowed for just more options and more power for the UX field to have. And that combined with UX strategy has really raised the level of user experience in many, many organizations, both nonprofit and for-profit. Along those lines, the term customer experience really has emerged and evolved, and it sometimes replaces the term of user experience, though it goes back to the alphabet soup where it really is very much the same things, and they quite often include many of the same things. Along those lines, and again, they also use end-to-end or usually describe end-to-end and all-encompassing experiences for products and services, much like user experience has. But again, many industries use different terms that really map to their industry, but in many ways, it's very, very similar, and there's a lot of commonality. Both an increasing use of user experience in the products, the services, there's a continuing need. Every few years, I teach this at other universities, and I always tell students, yeah, it looks good for a few years, looks good for a few years. Well, I kind of got tired of saying that a few years ago because I keep on saying it, but the profession itself is continuing to expand, as well as the amount of job opportunities. There's still a tremendous disparity between the amount of jobs available and the amount of people who are qualified to fill them. So it's a field that's continually growing and has been for a good decade more, and I don't see that really slowing down anytime in the near future. I ran across this a couple of weeks ago, and I was just looking at the web, and I found there's because Honda now has a personal jet people can buy, and it's called the Honda Jet Elite. And I was just going through the website, and I was actually really astonished at one. They were showing the instrumentation, the instrument panel for the pilots in the airplane. But one of the things that like this promotional material kind of really made me smile, because it was all talking about how the human machine interface for optimal safety, and all the information that they have written here is very much UX specific and focusing on how it provides you a tremendous amount of information, but it's easy to access, and it maps to how humans do think, do act, and not overwhelm people with, or not overwhelm the pilots with all this information while still having all these safety features involved. So it's really kind of, in my way, UX has come full circle, because now like they're selling jets and they're trying to espouse what great user experience and human factors they have within the cockpit. So I thought that was particularly interesting. So one of the books, if people are interested, I suggest this to everybody, is called The Design of Everyday Things. It's an older book, but it really made me rethink everything. And when I teach classes in the Introduction to UX, I actually strongly suggest people read this book, because it really kind of just makes you think about what is usability, design features, design focuses, things like that. And then also I have a list of the various URLs and some of the ones that I've talked about here. So that's the presentation I have. I'm happy to take questions, and to also let people know that we will be recording that. This is being recorded. It will be posted in about a week. And again, if anyone has any questions, please feel free. I'll go back to the beginning there. Does anyone have any questions? I will stop sharing.
Chris, we got one question here. Could you please explain what a design system is?
That's a good question. So design system is, it's in my mind, it's always kind of it's similar to an enterprise-wide system, such as something like SAP, or some like large learning management or content management system that would be in an organization. And traditionally, those have not really had much user experience or usability involved in it, because it was most important that it was functioning, and there was lots of safety and privacy and security around that. But as those have become more and more important in larger organizations, that's what has been happening. I did not realize Don Norman was an MIT class. Don Norman is the one that is credited with coming up with the concept of user-centered design in the mid-'80s, when he was at the University of California, San Diego. And he's still around. He's very much been an influencer and kind of the chief curmudgeon and visionary in our field. Does anyone else have any questions? Well, I'm going to stop the recording now, and if anyone does have any questions, or we'll certainly hang out for a while, and I'm happy to